consistency, and TAC for short. I'm not sure if we can mix them up, the three C's, but maybe Zuel can explain that, and also the order in naming them. But this topic is very much related to the IPCC guideline. Every time you go to the chapter of the IPCC guideline, you always find this term, TAC principle. Everywhere you can see how completeness is treated, how the consistency and time series of the data. So these are the principles that we would like to learn from Zuel today. Like yesterday, uncertainty is also important. It's always treated well in the reporting using the guideline. So overall, the main issue of this topic really is a good practice to be practiced by countries, by reporter, whoever is responsible in delivering the report for the UNFCCC. So without further ado, I give the time back to Rupesh. He's going to lead us in moderating us in discussing with topics that are going to be presented by Zuel today. Rupesh.
Thank you, Daniel. And again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Like Daniel mentioned, we are very happy and delighted to see everyone is here. And of course, the sessions are very informative, very useful. So that is definitely a good draw. So Daniel already provided a good introduction of the topic. And our resource person, Jewel Rahul from Mexico City. She joins us from exactly around the other side of the globe, so that's interesting. We will have two sessions today, half an hour each. Session 7, which is where Zuel will discuss the TAC principles. And our main point of discussion is how TAC diagnostics can be used to improve the Frel for Indonesia. And then second, session 8, for another half an hour. She will go in detail with those principles after providing the introduction, how those principles can be applied for the Frel 2020, and when the improvement happens from 2016 to 2020, how those principles can be taken into account. So we are in for a good ride with Zuel. Without taking much time, I will hand it over to Zuel. So Zuel, over to you.
Thank you, Rupesh. Let me share my screen. Okay, so you can see my screen, but you can see the whole screen or just the two tiny slides?
Two tiny slides.
Okay. I think now you can see just one.
Yes.
Well, okay, perfect. Thank you very much for your time in this presentation. I'm really happy to be part of this workshop and to share with you some of my experience participating in different review process from different Frels from different countries. So these are more like guidelines and good practices. At the end, the countries are allowed to do what they consider better. The main concern with the TAC is that we need to justify and we need to define and to be completely transparent in the process we do for our Frel. This means methodology, uncertainties, emission factor. So what the convention is looking for is to have a whole idea about the process and to be able to replicate the estimations if they want to do it. So what we're going to see during this first half an hour is the general context of the TAC, that is transparency, accuracy, comparability, completeness, and consistency, and then to define these concepts, and finally, some examples of the application of these principles when we review or when we do the technical assessment of the different roles. So in general, if we want to check or to look for specific information about the definition of this or the guidelines or the decisions that the countries must follow to complete with this tag, it's first the first decision of the Convention of Paris 16 in the paragraph 70. It's the activities that the countries should include or are able to include as part of their Frel. That is deforestation, degradation, conservation, forest management, and enhancement of stocks, of carbon stocks. Then, in this same decision, the countries are allowed to do it under their national circumstances. So the UNFCCC is not expecting that all countries have the same level of uncertainty or the same level of accuracy, but just be transparent and clear about the different procedures. Then we have Decision 12, Conference of Paris 17, that is more the rules or the guidelines for the Frel, that we need to do it periodically and we need to update it. And also establish the technical assessment process, the rules, who is going to be part, the process that they have to follow to do the technical assessment, the specific points that the team or the review team need to consider, that is the data, the methodologies, and the procedures for the Frel, and not to be intrusive to the country's decision. So all these concepts are related about the methodologies, the data, and procedures, but not the decision that the country takes to include or not something. But it is important that if we are going to omit or to avoid certain information, we need to justify why we are taking that decision. The UNFCCC principles are 5: transparency, completeness, consistency, accuracy, and comparability. But for the Frel, we're just focusing on 4 of them. That is that the Frel must be transparent, complete, consistent, and accurate. The comparability for the greenhouse gas inventories and the BUR is more related to be able to compare the BUR or the reports or the different tables of the greenhouse gas emissions with other countries. In the case of the forest reference emission level, it's a little bit difficult to compare between the different countries because the activities or the national circumstances are going to be different. So we are going to focus mainly in these 4 concepts. Then we have Decision 13 for Conference of Paris 19 that assess the accordance with guidelines, define that the technical assessment must be facilitative and not intrusive with the country. It established some requirements or condition for the technical exchange of information. Indonesia already submitted their forest reference emission level and also has this part. When you submit your Frel and then you receive some questions about the information, you have to send more information to the team. And then during 1 week, the team is based on Bonn and work with the Frel and also have meetings or conference with the country to check specific points or to clarify some points. The idea is to be clear of the information that the country has or don't have for the development of referral, and also to give some recommendation of the information and the way this information is presented in the Frel. Also, for this technical assessment, the team will focus on the consistency with the BUR or the last greenhouse gas inventory presented for the country. So it is important to use the same information in both reports because sometimes the Frel is just a summary of some specific parts. Maybe you are not going to describe the whole uncertainty process or the whole process of how you estimate your activity data, but this information must be an annex of your greenhouse gas inventory. Also, they review the historical data and give some recommendations to improve for the next from the next Frel. And also sometimes the party have the information and it's allowed to include new elements or to, no, it's not correct, but to improve the information that is presented in the Frel. So this is the framework of the decisions and the information that the UNFCCC or the technical assessment team is looking for. It's to understand how is built the forest reference emission level and try to identify if it is comprehensive and transparent. So this part of transparent, complete, consistent, accurate is related to the methodology and how we are describing or writing or explaining how we decide to include something or not, and the way we are doing the different parts of the report. Also, if you are going to submit your second Frel, it is important that you describe the differences between the first submission and the second submission. It is clear that you are going to do some improvements, and that is going to be the main reason between with the difference between both reports. But even though it is important to notice and to document that part in your next Frel. Also, if you are going to omit certain pool or activity because you don't have the information, because you are doing some improvements and are not ready for the date that you are submitting your Frel, it is important to notice that and to explain why you are omitting that information or why that information is considered with general emission factors or default emission factor from the IPCC. So all the explanation that it's needed to be clear what you do and why. Then the other important point is the definition of forest. The goal is that we use the same definition of forest in the BUR or the greenhouse gas inventory and the Frel. In case we need to use a different approximation, it is important to explain why we're doing that and the comparison between both difference in order to give the opportunity to the technical expert to understand if they found differences between the greenhouse gas estimations, to be able to understand why are different the different estimations. Then the part of completeness refers to the provision of the whole information that they need to re-estimate or reconstruct or rebuild the Frel. Most of the time, they are not going to do all the estimations to check that all the data are correct, but they are going to check some specific data. For example, if you have a specific emission factor for a certain line cover or something like that, they are going to check that specific part. So that's the reason they are asking this information. And during this technical assessment, as I already mentioned, the important part is the consistency with corresponding anthropogenic forest-related greenhouse gases, the historical data, if we're going to use the same historical data we already submit in a previous version, or if we are going to change the baseline or also the years that we are reporting. The description of the different policies, this is important because sometimes when we are working with a Frel, we develop red strategies or red policies for the country. And this is important because some of the changes that we are going to have in the land covers or in the estimation are just a consequence of the activities we are doing. So that's why it is important to include this specific point to be clear why we have these changes in our emissions and why we are having these results. Then, as I already mentioned, also the description of the changes to previous submitted Frel, if we are doing some improvements or if we are considering new pools or new stocks. And well, the differences between one and the other, and the definition of forest. I'm so repetitive in these points because it is important to consider them. And sometimes when we are working or developing our own Frel, for us is obvious information, but not for someone that is going to read it for the first time. So when we write or when we prepare the document and all the annex that we are going to deliver, it is important to consider that they are technical experts, but they don't know our national circumstances. So that's why it is important to be clear with all the information and to include all this information. So that's the general framework and the information that the UNFCCC requests us to include, but we are going to be a little bit deeper in the definition of these concepts and how we are going to use it or for which specific elements these components are important. First is the transparency. The idea with transparency is that the reader of the document and the technical assessment team is able to understand what we are doing. If we are doing some assumptions for the methodologies or assumptions about our activity data or the pools that we are including or not, it is important to be transparent and to document all that information. The idea is that if they want to replicate some estimation or to get deeper in some specific points of our report, they are able to do it. At the end, they are not going to say like, yes, you are correct or you are wrong. The idea of this technical assessment is to give some recommendations and to give some of their expertise to be able to improve our next Frel. Then the part of the consistency is more related to have the same information or the same methodologies between our BUR or our greenhouse gas inventory with the Frel. This is related with the part of the information, how much information we are going to include in one report and the other. So the idea is to be able to get in deeper in the information, looking at the BUR and not always asking all the information that we want to depart. So in general, this is the concept of consistency, to be consistent between our BUR and our Frel. Then the part of the comparability, the comparability, it's, as I already say, more related when we review or when we do the greenhouse gas inventories, when we have specific tables and formats to follow to report our emissions in the different categories and subcategories. But here the comparability, we can understand it as comparable to our BUR or our greenhouse gas inventory. But in general, this is not the focus of the tag, so we can avoid the third C, specifically for the Frel. Then is the part of the completeness. This completeness is related to the guidelines of the IPCC. This means that we must cover all the sources, sinks, and all the gases. And we need to report all of these conditions for the activities that we are including as reforestation, degradation, conservation, management, or carbon stock enhancement. So this is in general what we need to include. In the case that we don't have the full information of one of the things, because we don't have all the data collected, or because our country have different land uses and we don't have a national forest inventory that have all the things or all the different land covers completely mapped, it is possible to report just the information that we have, but we have to be clear of why we are omitting that information. So most of the times we just include a paragraph that this ink or this pool or this gas is not included because we don't have the specific data for this. Also here in the completeness, it is possible to include or to use the default emission factors from IPCC. This increases our uncertainty, yes, but also is a good way to complete our inventory and to have all the information that we need for the Frel. So finally, this is a decision of the country if you want to work with IPCC default emission factors, or if you prefer just to report certain categories or certain things, and you just need to put the note or the information that you are not considering that pool and the reason you are not including it. Then the other part is to cover all the country. It is also possible to work with a subnational Frel and as an improvement for the second or the third version to cover the whole country. So as in the last point, if you are going to work with a subnational approach, you just need to report and to explain why you are working with this information. The idea of the completeness and the consideration is that you have to work with the best information available. So it's not if you are reporting everything with tier 3 or tier 2, it's more that you are able to complete the full activities or the full historical information that you have to complete all the story of the situation of your forest. Is more the guidelines for this part of the completeness. Then it's a part of the accuracy. Accuracy is a measure of the exactness of an emission or removal estimations. So here is highly related with the part of the uncertainty, but besides the uncertainty is that you are sure that you are using all the information that you have and is the best information possible to be used to report or to do the estimations. The idea is here to have the estimations clear, to not underestimate or subestimate the emissions and removals. This is complicated because sometimes when we don't have the information, for example, when we pass from forest to croplands or to grasslands, maybe we don't have specific, we have the information of the biomass in the first stage, that is forest, but when they pass to grassland or to croplands, we don't have the information of the increasing of biomass in that step. So maybe we are not considering that that information because we don't have it. If it is the case, we just have to describe or to explain why we are not including these transitions or this change between the biomass between one stage and the other in order to be able to notice and to consider this for an improvement in the next time. Also, for all these different approaches or the different conditions, it depends of the party and it depends of their capabilities, the financial resources, and different national circumstances. So the best recommendation to follow all these principles is to report and to document all the different steps and the different information you are using or why you take a decision and not the other possible. Then these principles, we can apply them for specific parts of the report. In general, it's for the full report, but the key points, for example, for consistency is a part of the first definition, the carbon pools that we have the same between the greenhouse gas inventory or the BUR with the Frel, activity data, emission factors, the methodologies, the emission estimations, and the geographical scope. So in general, when we're talking about consistency, the reviewers are going to focus in these main points. Then for the part of the transparency, they're going to check the methodology, the statistical procedures, the uncertainty, if it's complete or incomplete. In this part of complete or incomplete uncertainty, this is referred if we're propagating the uncertainties, and we are considering the uncertainties for the emission factors, activity data, and other parameters that we are using, and to collect all the different errors that we have during the process of the estimation. Then to be transparent in the description or how we are going to justify the decisions or the assumptions that we are taking to develop the Frel. And also, if we omit certain pooled activities or gases, it is important to report it. If we omit the report or we just avoid one of the different pools or gases, when the technical assessment team review may think that you forget to consider that pool. And the question is why you don't include it. So to avoid that, it's a good practice to just include a paragraph explaining why you are not going to report that specific gas or pool. Then the part of the accuracy is related also to the methodology, statistical procedures, uncertainty, the justification, if you are using or explaining clearly and in a good way why you are not including certain things, the pools, the stock and sinks, and also the first definition. Other important point that it's transversal for different elements is the historical data. The historical data, it's important because this is going to be part of the internal consistency of the report. During the technical assessment for the Frel, we are not going to focus specifically of the technical consistency between the time series. This is part more for the WUR technical assessment, but we are going to look for it, and we are going to check that you are using the same emission factors during all the time series and everything. So that you are using the same certification of forest, the same volumetric equations. So in general, it's for this point that you use the same information and the same methods during all the historical data that you are using for your Frel. In general, these concepts are easy to understand, but sometimes when we try to do it in the practice with the WUR or when we write a Frel, this is going to be a little bit more difficult because sometimes we cannot catch up all the different points. So here are certain, not exercise, but examples about situations for the countries. And the idea is that you can help me to set which of the different principles are related. And then I'm going to give you like, well, the answer, or which are the main components that are related, and also some key elements or good practices related to this. So the first example is, in order to obtain activity data, country X has used image interpretation techniques by combining visual and digital interpretation. For the latter, country X uses visual interpretation with a large number of different image interpreters. It is not clear if it is the same methodology used for the greenhouse gas inventory. This is the general situation that a person who is reviewing the Frel noticed. So, could you help me to tell me which of these principles are related with this?
So I think this is more like a small quiz where we will need participants' involvement.
Yes.
Yes. So at this point, participants can either type their responses or raise their hand, whatever is easy. Jewel just wants to know for this statement, which of the 5 principles will be most clearly applicable. Consider yourself as a reviewer, of the technical assessment, and then you observe this, and then what do you? So I'm looking if there is one response. the response from Irawan Asad is consistency, comparability. Then Solehin also said consistency and comparability. Yeah, and then one Anna Koscieni says consistency, comparability, and accuracy. Adam from
Yes.
yeah. So yeah, so we have multiple responses come in, and all of them referring to consistency, accuracy, and comparability.
Yes, exactly. The main points here is consistency, comparability, and accuracy. The key point here is that the country X has used image interpretation techniques inconsistently between one report and the other. That's the first part. And the second is that when they combine visual and digital interpretation and also use a large number of different image interpreters, the errors increase. It's just to report and to try to consider like other elements. So some of the recommendations for the country could be, first, using a consistent approach to use spatial interpretation across the time series. Also, to move from single data interpretation to interpretation techniques for time series or satellite images. Also, to introduce automated processing to ensure coherent interpretation, or to compare multi-temporal compound images. So this is like a problem or an issue. It's not a problem. That issue that some countries present in their Frels, and this is some of the different solution or recommendation that the technical assessment team could do for the country. The final decision of which approach they want to use, or if they want to keep using the same methodology for that interpretation, the only one that are able to decide is the country. But in general, the technical assessment team are going to give you some recommendation. So I think that I have 4 different examples here. The second one is the symmetric information for the National Forest Assessment for mangrove forest was not considered for the Frel due to the high error associated with the corresponding emission factor, which arose because their values were derived from measurements taken at only 2 sample plots. Country X considered mangrove as wet wood-liver forest. So this is the situation that the technical assessment found when they were doing the technical assessment of the Frel of the country X. So which of the different principles you think this issue is going to be related?
We have one response. Sijit says accuracy. Let's wait for a few more seconds because people may be typing. Yeah, Virni also says accuracy. Catherine says completeness and accuracy. Solehin says accuracy and completeness. So 2 points are emerging, accuracy, completeness. Then Anna adds transparency into it. So we have now 3, transparency, accuracy, and completeness.
Okay. So mainly, because it's not only focusing this, is transparency, completeness, and accuracy. This example have 2 different points. The first one is that they decide not to include this information because the high error associated, that even if you have a high error associated, that doesn't mean that you are not able to include it. You are able to include it, and you can mention or notice that this information is not completely certain, or that your uncertainty is high, or to explain why you decide to consider this in another way. In this case, the solution that the country do or the approach that they consider when they improve their Frel was to include mangrove as an independent stratum. This allowed them to have specific estimation for this, and also to have specific information taken for another country that is near them. So with this information, they estimate a emission factor that is better than the one that they think that they have, because they were just working with 2 sample plots, and with that information they estimate the emission factor, and just with 2 plots the uncertainty was too high, so they decide to consider the information from other country and to report it. The key thing here is to report it. So as a good practice is, if you have for a specific land cover with high uncertainty because you don't have all the information or you don't have a lot of data to estimate the emission factor, you can separate that category, and the other and consider your uncertainty. Even uncertainty is high, it is important to include it or to use your national emission factor. But in case you decide that you don't want to use your emission factor because you consider that that uncertainty or that plots don't represent the whole ecosystem or this whole land cover, it is possible also to consider to use the emission factor for other country, just to explaining why that emission factor is better than yours. In the case of small countries in Central America, this is something that they can use emission factors from other countries, but not in all cases this approach is the best one. The third example is country X has not considered the carbon stocks corresponding to a land use after deforestation take place because they don't have all the information of this. That is that the post-deforestation carbon stocks are equal to 0. So, which tax principles you consider are related with this issue?
I'm waiting for any responses. As soon as I see someone, I'll read it out. We have one response. It says completeness from Irawan Asad. And completeness and accuracy from Adam Geran.
Yes, this is related to completeness, accuracy, and transparency. The key point here is that the main issue that the TAC team identify is that with this submission, they are overestimating emissions from deforestation. The country X has not considered the carbon stocks corresponding to a land use after deforestation take place. This has been due to the lack of data on post-deforestation land uses and due to the lack of carbon stock values for the specific post-deforestation land use. This is so common for many countries because we don't have all the information that we want to have to report everything. So in general, the recommendations or the good practice or some of the advice that the technical assessment team recommends is using the average carbon stocks for a variety of crops associated to post-deforestation land use in the case that the land use change occur from forests to crops. The other one that is just a temporary solution is to use emission factors from the IPCC database, the general default values, and Other is using the full values for annual and perennial crops that you have in your country. So this is different approach for the solution. The main point here, or with this example, behind transparency and completeness is the accuracy, because the key point is that they are overestimating emissions. So sometimes when we are saying that the key element is that they don't have complete the inventory or something, the reviewers see the problem or the issue in a different way. The fourth one is the uncertainty. Well, the last, I think is the last example, is the uncertainty of the emission factor for forest plantation is only 1.45%, while that for rainforest is 32%. Country X did not provide detailed information on the methods used to estimate the uncertainty of the emission factors. So as in the last time, which TAC principles you think this issue is related with?
While we are waiting for some responses, I will take this opportunity to remind that the timing for this session is kind of over. So we can come back to a few more examples in the discussion session. I don't want to.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know how many slides or examples you have, but if...
no, I think it's I just have one more, but we can finish with this one.
So we have a response, which is completeness, accuracy, and transparency.
Yes, exactly this one. The first part here is to include all the information of the methods used to estimate uncertainty. Sometimes these kind of differences between the uncertainties for emission factors are related with the data that we have from our national forest inventory, that we don't have a lot of plots for specific land covers. So that's why our uncertainty increases. But even though it is important to mention or to explain why we have these differences between certain emission factors between the different land covers. And also it is a good practice to explain why or which are the elements for these potential sources of error. If it's that we don't have a lot of plots, if we have differences between our same ecosystem or land cover, if it is located in different parts of the country. Also, that means that we're going to have differences between the biomass of the different trees, even if it's the same species. So, well, the last one was also related to this part. I'm just going to comment the example. In this case, the country X have forest fires emission that represent 23% of the Apollo sector, but they didn't include this information to the Frel. The main reason was because they don't have enough information to report all the different pools and all the different sources and all the different activity data that they need to report these emissions. So the recommendation, as always, well, this is related to transparency, completeness, and accuracy. And the recommendation is to include all the pools, even if we don't have all the information that we want. And if we need to use default emission factor, it is allowed to do it as a temporary report. And also to decide or to justify if we consider that even the percentage of emission, if we consider that it is not a relevant category for the country, we can justify or document this information by doing a key category analysis. So that's all the presentation for the first part. That it's the definition of the TAC IPCC principles.
Thank you, Jewel. There is one question. I don't know how many questions we can take for each session, but there's one which is related to your example, I think 4, where we talk about uncertainty. And the question is raised by Joko Pihanto. He is asking that in cases where enough data is not available for calculating uncertainty of activity data and emission factor, can expert judgment be used? Is it permissible to use some expert judgment?
Yes, but you have to explain, well, first you have to explain that you don't have the information, that you need to estimate the uncertainties, and then you have to explain why you are taking that expert judgment as valid. If you have that information in a paper, or if it's the specialist of statistical uncertainties for that category or something like that, the key point is that you can explain and justify why you are taking that decision. But it's completely valid to consider the expert judgment as a reason.
Well, thank you. One idea is to either take some questions here, or we can take questions after the end of your next session, because I have a feeling, since this is the same topic and you will go in detail and provide some more maybe examples and things, I have a feeling that some of the questions might be answered in the next presentation. I feel that, I'm not 100% sure. But what I will encourage for all participants is to type their questions in the meanwhile. And then I will invite Professor Daniel before we move to next session, if he has any observation, any comment, anything to say before we move on. That will give us like a few minutes of break between the two sessions. So if you have any comment, Professor Daniel.
Thank you, Rupesh. It's been very nice conversation here, and I like the idea of having mini quiz, and it's really appropriate to look at that. At least in the first instance, I myself was guessing, but sometimes it's accurate, not necessarily complete. But yeah, it's a good exercise. The next round will be about the diagnosis of Indonesian Frel 2016. So Zuel has the opportunity to visit the website, or even she was the, I'm not sure, the assessor on our assessment on the Frel, but we will hear from her as a fresh kind of reader on the 2016 Frel, how tactable it was, or sensitive the Indonesian Frel was. And this discussion will help us and also the Frel team how to improve the next Frel in terms of the TAC principle. So I think that's the notion of the next presentation and discussion.
Yes, so I do not see any questions typed on question answer box or chat box. So I would say, I would encourage all participants to type the question, but in the interest of time, let's move on to next session, if it's okay with the usual. And then we will have some time in the end for discussion, kind of like a summary, and at that time we can take comments and questions. So if that's all right, then let's move to the next session. Professor Daniel has already provided some introductions, so I will not take it again. Over to you.
You are muted, Joel.
Thank you. For this part, first I did the exercise to read the Frel that you submit to the UNFCCC, well, that Indonesia submit to the UNFCCC, and do like my own checklist of the different principles, of the different elements that you have to to check if you are doing a technical assessment process for any fraud. So after that exercise, I also review the comments that the convention did when they review the fraud. So most of them are so similar. So in general, if you work with that process, my idea here is just to give you some ideas or recommendation about the specific point that they already mentioned, and some of them are going to be new or recommendation to a specific clarification that I think are going to be useful to improve your fraud. So in general, the objectives are to diagnose the existing fraud and to give you some recommendations about the alignment of this fraud with the TAC principles, and then some specific points and some specific recommendation from that specific issues. So in general, the information are transparent and complete as a whole. The report includes all the national forests in the entire territory. The activities that are included is deforestation and degradation. The years that it's covered in this report is 1990 to 2012. The pools above biomass is included for all strata. Soil organic carbon is included only for deforestation and forest degradation on peatlands. Below biomass, dead wood and soil organic carbon are not included because you don't have the information in that moment. So this is like the general recommendation that I found in the report that the technical assessment team did to the Frel 2016. So in general, the key points, and some of these are similar from the examples that I present in the other one, it's to include the gross emission from deforestation that are associated with clear-cut forest, excluding any potential biomass regrowth and associated removals after the deforestation events. This is something important. These transitions, if you have the transition from forest to annual croplands, you can assume that it's an equilibrium, and it is because it is harvesting annually and you can report it at zero. But if the transition is between to forest to perennial crops, a good practice or a recommendation is to include and to consider that increment of biomass for the new crops. Even if you don't have the specific emission factor for that crop, you can use the IPCC default emission factor. That's another option, or to consider another crop that is relevant in your country and have similar growth. So another important point is to analyze if these conversions are significant or not. If, for example, in the case of Mexico, most of the deforestation from forest to crops are related to avocado. So at the beginning, that was not really an issue. We can use another emission factor, but right now for certain states that are subnational governments, it is important to start considering and to estimate the emission factor for avocado because it represents more than the 60% of the deforestation. So it depends on the national circumstances, but in general, good practice is to consider this and to include all the different pools and the different transitions. Another point is the use of emission factors from wetland supplements that are intended to be applied only to drain organic soils. And the comment here is that there is no difference between areas with and without drainage. If the case is that this is not a relevant point for you, the difference between with or without, the good practice is to document the process and the reasons you are considering this point. It's not a good decision or a bad decision. At the end, it's a country decision, but you need to document the process and to justify why you are taking that decision. Another good practice is to recognize the lack of data, to explain that you don't have that data right now, but you are going to improve, or you are going to start working with that category for the next Frel. And also to describe why you are thinking to do it. Sometimes if we include a general description of what activities or which activities we are going to develop in the future to improve our Frel, also we are going to receive some recommendations about it, or some new ideas of how we can improve it. Finally, this process to review a report gives us the opportunity to have at least 2 experts that are really, really experts in the topic, and they are able to give us recommendations. So it's also a good idea to share our inquiries about these points that we want to improve for the future. So we also receive some recommendations. Another important point is that activity data covers some periods up to 6 years. It's the frame time between one data and the other, and the emission factors that are used for from the wetland supplements are annual. So it is important to be consistent. In this case, the word that I use, the same units. If we are working with annual data from emission factors, it is important to have also the annual data for the activity data. We can analyze the information, or we can consider to use another emission factors or to make some assumption of this, but try to be clear that we are using the same units in the time frame. Another point is step-by-step description of the methodology. And sometimes not all the methodology is described. You have some assumption that you don't explain or fully explain. You just mention some specific points. It's going to be useful to have the full description, or to, if you don't want to describe all the process for certain activity, you can specify that this information is described in the Annex 2 or Annex number, wherever you have, from the BUR or the greenhouse gas inventory. And another point is that you have different approaches for calculating means for the biomass pools over the reference period. The recommendation is to have or to use the same methodology. I think this specific point, it's not that you're using different approach, is the way that it is explained in the document. But well, I'm not really sure about that. So that's the important point, that you need to be clear of how the country do it. So that's the recommendation, to use the same methodology, and also to explain clearly the different steps, or to be able to follow the Frel of the methodology as a receipt. So be able to follow and to do all the things if you want to do it when you're doing the technical assessment, yeah. Then the first definition, that for the Frel 6 natural forest classes are considered, and in the greenhouse gas inventory, it's also included forest plantation. So if we're going to use different forest definition, it is important to document it and to explain why we are using different approaches. The goal at the end is to work with the same forest definition. Sometimes it is not possible because we are working with different activities, and the information that we are including in the Frel is focused on our main points or main hotspots. But it is important to document and to explain why we are including or not certain categories, or why we changed the definition of forest. Then is the part of the uncertainty. The, at the end, also, it's a good practice to estimate the uncertainties for the different elements. Osvaldo was talking about the propagation of uncertainty. This is a good practice. Sometimes we don't have all the information available to do this, but it is also important to explain or to notice in the process which elements we are considering for uncertainty and which ones we are not considering them because we have a lack of information, or because right now we are start thinking or estimating that uncertainty. Sometimes the information that we use for activity data is information that we have for other different policies or programs in the country. So for the first objective that maps or that information were developed, they don't need to have an uncertainty analysis. So when we're using that maps or that information, we don't have that uncertainties or the errors, the associated errors for that. So it is important just to document it and to start thinking how we are going to improve this for the future. The next part is the carbon pools that are included in the Frels are above ground biomass and soil organic carbon. So the first one is reported for all the different strata. Soil organic carbon is included only for deforestation and forest degradation. Below ground biomass, litter, and deadwood are not included. Soil organic carbon is only included, only included on peatlands. So this is more than a recommendation. It's that you should include all of this because it's part of the decisions. At the end, it depends on the national circumstances, but it's a good practice to include it, even if we are using IPCC default emission factors. I know that most of the time we want to have our Frel or greenhouse gas inventory with low uncertainty and using IPCC emission factor increased uncertainty, but this is also a good practice. At the end is the decision of the country, which of the different approaches want to follow. But I think this point is something that if you don't include all the different pools, this is going to be a point that the technical assessment is going to comment you and to mention. So at the end, the idea is to explain why we are including it or not, but well, you have two different options here. This is another important point. It's about fires. In the BUR, it is noticed that fires occur frequently in the country and represent an important amount of emissions, but we cannot find this information in the Frel. If you want to say that this is an important category or not, my recommendation is to consider the key category analysis, not only for sectors, for the specific sectors, also considering subcategories or subsectors to have a clear understanding or a clear justification if it is significant or not. This is one point. The other one is that we need to be consistent between our BUR or greenhouse gas inventory with our Frel. So the recommendation is to include it. And if the point or the key elements are the uncertainty, it's also valid to include it and to explain that you don't have the uncertainties ready or the uncertainties are under development, and that information it's not the best option, but you can include this information as an annex of your Frel, not specifically as the main part of the report, but to include this information in order to present a complete Frel, even if it's not part of the emission reductions that you want to present. So that's another option to avoid or to work with this specific point. And this one is related to land cover metrics of peatlands, that you don't have like the information for each year, and that there is a lack of alignment between the activity data between forest land cover and peatlands. This is something that happens in many countries. The different jumps between the discontinuity between the information. The key point here is to report and to explain why you have this discontinuity. Also to think of other different approaches for activity data. This is not an easy point because moving from different technologies imply human resources, capabilities, financial resources, and it's not easy to take a decision of we're going to move to another methodology or another technique to do the things. But well, these are some examples of the different approaches. In case that you're going to work with the same information, it is important to report or to explain not only the reason, also the assumptions that you are going to consider to align the data or to work with the discontinuity of information. Yeah, this presentation was shorter than the other one, but in general, or as a conclusion, first is that the technical assessment report and the technical assessment team are not going to judge the Frel, are going to give you recommendation to improve it. So it is important to share the information and to explain the different problems or the different concerns that you have during the development of the Frel. It is important to document everything, justification, assumption, the improvement plans, because sometimes we don't have the information right now, but we already have started working with that. So report or to mention that information. If we are going to avoid certain information, explain why we are deciding to do that. The other point is the Frel at the end, when we develop it, we are working with the best information available. This could mean that we want to reduce uncertainties because that's our goal. It's okay, but also your goal could be to complete or to cover all the different sources, sinks, and pools. So it depends on the approach you want to have here to consider the best information available, but it doesn't really matter the approach or which element you consider as your best information available, but be clear to include and to explain it. Then we'll include all the different sources, sinks, and pools. And finally, to identify or to comment or to mention the next steps of improvement that you are going to have. Finally, to prepare the Frel, the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, all these reports are part of a cycle of information. You are going to keep working on it each 2 years or something, but you are going to work with this. So the idea is to be better or to improve our reports each time we present it. Not all the circumstances for the countries and the moments that they update or, well, they submit information are the same. the capabilities, the resources, the techniques, and the methodologies available in the countries are different. To obtain all the historical data in the same way, or to have all the information completely systematized between different years or annually, it's difficult. But the idea is to explain how we are going, or how we work with that information to produce our report in the best way that it's possible for us. And well, that's it.
Thank you so much, Will. This was a really very helpful, useful presentation, and I believe a lot of our participants who are closely involved in the Indonesian Frel process would have found this last presentation very, very useful and